What if a decorated U.S. Army colonel was pulled over on an empty highway, not for a traffic violation, but because a bitter police officer couldn't stand the sight of a confident black woman refusing to bow to his authority? That's exactly what happened to Colonel Naomi Barrett. She had just left a veteran ceremony, her uniform neatly folded beside her, when Officer Daniels stopped her for no reason. What followed was a tense, humiliating confrontation that would later spiral into a dangerous, high-speed chase and a brutal hand-to-hand fight in the middle of nowhere. But Naomi wasn't just a soldier, she was a tactician, trained to survive war zones. And she wasn't going down quietly. What began as an abuse of power became a national scandal, a courtroom reckoning, and a career-ending downfall for a man who thought he was untouchable. Stay with us until the end, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment with your thoughts. Colonel Naomi Barrett had served her country for over 2 decades, leading troops through foreign combat zones, coordinating high-stakes missions, and earning the respect of everyone who truly understood what leadership meant. But on one quiet stretch of highway in her own country, none of that mattered. She wasn't seen as a leader, a decorated officer, or even as an American hero. To Officer Daniels, she was just a black woman alone in a car, someone to control, someone to intimidate. The sun was setting as Naomi drove home from a military function honoring veterans. She was dressed in civilian clothes, her neatly folded uniform resting in the passenger seat. That's when the flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't drifted out of her lane. Still, she calmly pulled over. Experience had taught her how to handle situations like this with composure, but this time, something felt off. Daniels approached with the swagger of a man used to getting his way. He didn't see Naomi, he saw a challenge. The tone in his voice was clipped, the way he looked at her full of contempt. When she respectfully asked why she was being stopped, he didn't answer. Instead, he told her to step out of the vehicle. When she explained that she was a colonel in the U.S. Army and had just come from a veteran event, he scoffed. "You? A colonel?" he smirked, looking her up and down. "You sure about that?" When Naomi couldn't produce her military ID, which was still in the pocket of her uniform back at the base, Daniels seized the opportunity to twist the situation. He accused her of suspicious activity and began searching her car without consent, throwing her belongings around like they were trash. It wasn't about law enforcement. It was about ego. And race. Daniels didn't question her story because it was unbelievable. He questioned it because it came from a black woman who held more power, more discipline, and more dignity than he could handle. That was the real issue. It wasn't about a traffic stop, it was about control. Daniels couldn't stand the idea that someone like Naomi didn't flinch, didn't beg, didn't shrink. He expected submission. What he got was quiet defiance. This wasn't just a case of misconduct. It was a textbook example of racial profiling, one that so many Americans, particularly black Americans, know far too well. Naomi's skin color was all it took for Daniels to assume guilt. Her calm confidence only made him angrier. He didn't see her as a person. He saw her as a threat to his authority, and in his mind, that made her fair game. But Naomi Barrett wasn't about to be anyone's victim. Continue watching to find out how a calm and calculated colonel turned a power-hungry officer's world upside down. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Colonel Naomi Barrett remained still, her hands visible, her voice calm. Years of military training had taught her that staying composed under pressure was often more powerful than any show of force. But she also recognized what was happening. This wasn't about a broken law or a legitimate concern. It was about an officer using his badge to assert dominance over someone he believed didn't belong, especially not in a position of authority above his own. It was about race, plain and simple. As Officer Daniels ransacked her vehicle, Naomi knew exactly what he was doing, fishing for any excuse to justify his actions. He wasn't looking for threats. He was hoping to find something, anything, that would confirm his prejudice. It didn't matter that she was a colonel. It didn't matter that she had spent her life defending the very rights he was now trampling on. In that moment, she was just a black woman he didn't believe deserved to be where she was. And that's what stung the most. When Daniels found nothing, no contraband, no stolen property, no fake ID, he didn't back down. Instead, he doubled down on his accusations, suggesting she was hiding something, as though her very presence on that road was inherently suspicious. He demanded she admit to things she hadn't done, hoping to provoke a reaction. But Naomi gave him nothing. She refused to give him the satisfaction of fear. Instead, she played her own card. Discreetly, she dialed a number from her phone, one she rarely used but had memorized long ago for emergencies. Within minutes, a call came through to Daniels's radio from headquarters. A captain's voice roared across the line, furious. Naomi wasn't just anybody. She was a respected officer in the United States Army, and what Daniels had just done was not only unethical, it was illegal. Daniels went pale. His swagger disappeared. In front of Naomi, he was ordered to stand down and personally escort her to the station to deliver an apology. But even with his reputation crumbling, Daniels couldn't hide the hatred in his eyes. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was angry that it hadn't worked, that this time, the system wasn't there to protect him. What had started as a traffic stop had revealed something deeper and more dangerous. Naomi had been profiled not because of what she did, but because of who she was, and how she looked. Daniel saw a uniform folded in her front seat and assumed it didn't belong to her. He saw confidence in her voice and assumed it was arrogance. He saw black skin and assumed guilt. That's the painful truth behind so many similar encounters across the country. For many black Americans, especially women, rank and respectability don't guarantee safety. Even decorated veterans aren't immune to the sting of discrimination. But Naomi Barrett was different. She wasn't going to let it slide. What happened next would change everything, for her, for Daniels, and for the system that had protected men like him for far too long. Stick around to see how one woman's discipline and courage brought justice where it was long overdue. And don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. We want to hear your voice in this conversation. After the confrontation, Colonel Naomi Barrett hoped the worst was behind her. She had reported the illegal stop, filed a formal complaint, and trusted the system to do its job. Officer Daniels was suspended, and Internal Affairs launched an investigation. On the surface, it looked like accountability was finally in motion. But Naomi had spent her life navigating structures built to exclude people like her. She knew better than to assume it was over. And she was right. A few days later, as she drove along the same stretch of highway, taking the route she always took, she noticed a dark sedan in her rearview mirror. It was subtle at first. The car kept its distance, blending in with traffic. But as the road grew emptier, the vehicle grew bolder. It drifted closer, lingered in her blind spot, and then began edging into her lane without signaling. Her instincts flared. This wasn't a coincidence. As the sedan pulled up alongside her, Naomi recognized the face behind the wheel, Daniels. Out of uniform, out of control, and seething with rage. The system had reprimanded him, but his ego hadn't recovered. He wasn't looking for redemption. He was looking for revenge. Daniels tried to force her off the road, using his car to hurt her toward the shoulder. But Naomi didn't panic. She let him think she was flustered, then cut her will sharply, escaping his trap. It was a tactical move, a maneuver she'd perfected in war zones, but now using it against a disgraced officer on a rural American highway. What followed was a dangerous, high-speed game of cat and mouse. Daniels was reckless, furious, consumed by the idea that this woman, a black woman, had dared to stand up to him and win. He couldn't accept it. To him, Naomi Barrett wasn't just a colonel or a symbol of justice, she was a threat to everything he believed he was entitled to. When the road grew empty, Daniels made his final move. He stopped his car in the middle of the highway and waited, forcing a confrontation. Naomi didn't run. She stopped too. She stepped out, calm and composed, even as Daniels exploded with accusations. He screamed that she had ruined his life, that people like her thought they could do anything without consequences. Naomi didn't respond with rage. She stood tall and answered with truth, "You did this to yourself." What happened next was swift and brutal. Daniels attacked her physically, thinking brute strength would get him the victory his authority had failed to deliver. But Naomi had been trained for moments exactly like this. She dodged, countered, and when he finally collapsed under the weight of his own rage, she restrained him and called the authorities. Even when stripped of his badge, Daniels believed he had the right to dominate her. Why? Because she was a black woman who had refused to be intimidated. That's what racial bias looks like, entitlement rooted so deeply, even disgrace isn't enough to uproot it. But Naomi Barrett wasn't just fighting for herself. She was standing up for everyone who's ever been targeted, dismissed, or endangered for daring to exist with pride. Stay with us, because what comes next turns this act of violence into a national reckoning. Don't forget to subscribe and leave your thoughts below. As the sound of sirens grew louder, Colonel Naomi Barrett stood firm beside Daniels' crumpled form. Her ribs ached, her jaw throbbed, but she remained composed. This wasn't just the aftermath of a physical fight, it was the result of decades of quiet battles waged against systems that had long ignored women like her. The officers who arrived on the scene were stunned. They knew who Naomi was, her record, her rank, her integrity. And now, they saw the broken man she had been forced to subdue, a disgraced officer, handcuffed by his own hubris. Naomi gave a detailed, unwavering statement. Her words were clear, her facts precise. She presented dash-cam footage, photos of her injuries, and calmly identified Daniels as her attacker. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The truth was loud enough. But Naomi also knew the deeper battle was just beginning. She filed formal charges: assault, attempted vehicular homicide, and reckless endangerment. She made sure the legal documentation was airtight. She contacted a trusted attorney, not just to press charges, but to launch a civil lawsuit. The goal wasn't money. It was accountability. Naomi understood that financial consequences would follow Daniels for the rest of his life, just like his actions would stay with her. Then she did something even bolder. She went public. Naomi contacted a respected journalist and shared her story, not just the highway ambush, but the original traffic stop. The illegal search. The condescending smirk. The subtle and not-so-subtle racism that had fueled it all. Within 24 hours, the headlines erupted across the nation. Army colonel attacked by suspended officer, racism, power, and the fight for justice. The response was explosive. Support flooded in from veterans, women's organizations, civil rights advocates, and everyday Americans who saw themselves in Naomi's story. But there was also backlash. Online forums lit up with the usual rhetoric: she should have just complied. He was doing his job. This is why cops are afraid to act. None of it surprised Naomi. She had seen it all before. In every major case of racial injustice, there were always voices trying to muddy the truth. But she didn't back down. She knew what Daniels had done, and what he represented. His actions weren't isolated. They were the symptom of a much bigger disease. Internal Affairs reopened every complaint ever filed against Daniels. Suddenly, a trail of misconduct emerged: racial profiling, intimidation, excessive force, all previously swept under the rug. But now, with national eyes watching, there was nowhere left for him to hide. Daniels was suspended indefinitely, and by the end of the month, he was terminated. But Naomi wasn't celebrating. This wasn't about revenge. It was about exposure. A system that had protected Daniels for years had finally turned on him, not because it wanted to, but because it had no choice. And Naomi Barrett made sure the world saw every single step of the fall. Justice wasn't just a verdict, it was a reckoning. And we're not done yet. Stick around for the final chapter, and don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment with your thoughts. The trial of former Officer Daniels became a national spectacle. Every major news outlet covered it, and the courtroom was packed with journalists, veterans, and citizens waiting to see if justice would truly be served. For Colonel Naomi Barrett, it wasn't about the cameras. It wasn't even about Daniels anymore. It was about the system. Would it finally stand up for someone who looked like her? As Naomi entered the courtroom in full uniform, the room went silent. She wasn't just a witness, she was a living contradiction to the stereotype that Daniels had tried to exploit. A black woman, a decorated military officer, and a leader who had spent her life defending the freedoms he had tried to strip away from her on the side of that highway. The prosecution laid out the case methodically. The dash cam footage told most of the story. There was Daniels' unlawful stop. His refusal to explain his reasoning. His aggressive search. And finally, the violent chase that ended with Naomi forced to defend herself. There was no room left for interpretation. But it was Naomi's testimony that struck the deepest chord. When asked why she didn't just back down, she answered plainly, "Because I've spent my life earning respect. I won't surrender that just to make someone else feel powerful." Daniels, now in a suit instead of a uniform, sat at the defense table trying to hold himself together. His legal team tried to paint him as a man under stress, someone who made a mistake in a moment of confusion. But Naomi's calm, clear account, paired with a mountain of evidence and a history of prior complaints, tore their argument to shreds. During cross-examination, Daniels was offered a chance to express remorse. He didn't take it. Instead, he doubled down, claiming he was just doing his job and that people like her always play the victim. The jury didn't take long. Daniels was convicted on multiple charges: attempted vehicular homicide, aggravated assault, and abuse of power under the color of law. The judge didn't mince words in the sentencing either. "You didn't act out of duty. You acted out of ego and prejudice. You saw a black woman and decided she didn't deserve respect. That choice has consequences." Daniels was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. But even then, Naomi didn't smile. This wasn't about watching him fall, it was about making sure others like him couldn't rise without scrutiny. Because racism in a badge isn't just dangerous, it's lethal. And far too often, it hides behind silence. But not this time. This time, the truth was louder. Naomi Barrett's fight wasn't just hers. It belonged to every American who's ever been judged by the color of their skin instead of the content of their character. Stay with us for the conclusion, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be heard. Colonel Naomi Barrett stood at the courthouse steps, the morning sun casting long shadows behind her as reporters shouted questions. But she said nothing. The trial was over, the sentence had been delivered, and Daniels, once a symbol of unchecked authority, was now a convict with 15 years ahead of him. Yet for Naomi, the journey didn't end there. Because the problem wasn't just one man. It was the system that had protected him for so long. In the days after the verdict, Naomi met privately with senior military leadership, civil rights organizations, and legal advocates. Her case had exposed deep cracks, not only in local law enforcement, but in how complaints against officers were dismissed, overlooked, or quietly buried. Daniels had a long record of misconduct. She wasn't the first person he had targeted. Just the first he couldn't break. She wasn't surprised when the backlash started online. Social media lit up with anonymous profiles accusing her of ruining a good officer's life. Pundits on late-night talk shows painted her as a political pawn. Some even implied she had set him up. Naomi had prepared herself for that. In America, especially for black women in power. Even surviving injustice could be twisted into a weapon against you. But she didn't retreat. Instead, she filed a civil suit against Daniels, seeking not only damages for the physical injuries she endured, but also to prevent him from ever entering another position of power. With a public judgment hanging over him, no police department, no private security firm, no consulting group would be able to ignore the facts. She wanted to make it legally impossible for him to quietly re-enter any system of authority. Her lawsuit sparked national conversations. On TV panels and podcasts, former officers spoke out, some in support, others in criticism. Yet the overwhelming public response favored Naomi. People saw what had happened, a black woman standing alone on a highway, facing a man with a badge who thought he could erase her identity with arrogance and hate. Her bravery forced real accountability. Daniels' past complaints, once sealed in internal reviews, were now public record. His defenders vanished. His name became synonymous not with service, but with abuse. And across the country, departments began re-evaluating how they handled misconduct reports. Naomi didn't want fame. She wanted change. And slowly, it came. She was invited to speak at law enforcement summits, military ethics panels, and colleges. Not as a victim, but as a leader. She spoke about racial bias, about the dangers of unchecked power, about how too many people who looked like her had to be perfect just to survive a routine traffic stop. She ended every talk with a message: respect is not something you should have to prove. It's something everyone deserves, regardless of their rank, their race, or their gender. And every time, the crowd stood and applauded. Because Naomi Barrett didn't just survive racism, she dismantled it. Stay with us for the final reflections in Part A7, and don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like Naomi's need to be remembered. Months after the verdict, Colonel Naomi Barrett returned to her routine with quiet determination. She wasn't seeking headlines anymore, she had never sought them in the first place. Instead, she focused on the impact that would outlast the news cycle. Daniels might have been sentenced, but Naomi knew the fight against racism, especially systemic racism, was far from over. She began working with local advocacy groups that aimed to reform police accountability systems. Naomi's experience, both as a decorated Army colonel and as a black woman harassed on a highway for driving while black, became a powerful testimony used to drive legislative conversations across multiple states. Her case was cited during committee hearings on proposed laws requiring body cams, transparent misconduct tracking, and independent civilian review boards. Naomi didn't just tell her story. She helped shape policy. Her presence in those rooms reminded lawmakers that racial profiling wasn't some abstract issue, it was lived, real, and still happening every day across America. Meanwhile, Daniels faded into obscurity, serving his sentence in federal prison. His name, once backed by a badge and inflated by arrogance, now carried the weight of disgrace. Naomi's lawsuit had been successful, resulting in a sizable judgment that ensured he'd never work in any enforcement capacity again. More importantly, it sent a loud message: abusing power has consequences. But despite everything, Naomi remained grounded. She continued her military service, mentoring younger officers and ensuring her story wasn't just remembered but taught. At Fort Hamilton, where she was stationed, her presence became a symbol of quiet resilience. Soldiers respected her not only for her rank but for the moral authority she carried, an authority built not on fear, but on dignity, strength, and truth. One spring afternoon, Naomi received a handwritten letter. It was from a young black woman in Chicago who had watched the coverage of the trial. She wrote, "I never thought someone who looked like me could win like that. You gave me hope." Naomi sat with that letter for a long time. Not because it surprised her, but because it affirmed something she had always believed: representation matters. Courage is contagious. As time passed, Naomi began hosting workshops for high school students, particularly young girls of color. She taught them about knowing their rights, standing tall under pressure, and most importantly, never letting anyone else define their worth. She used her story not to relive trauma, but to spark purpose in others. Colonel Naomi Barrett had faced down racism in one of its ugliest forms, abuse of power backed by a badge. But she hadn't just endured. She had exposed, fought back, and reshaped the system from within. And through her strength, countless others found the inspiration to speak up and demand better. Her story wasn't just about one officer and one highway. It was about a nation still grappling with its flaws, and one woman who refused to stay silent. If Naomi's story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful, real-life stories that deserve to be heard. Colonel Naomi Barrett's story reminds us that standing up to injustice takes not just courage, but clarity, discipline, and an unshakable sense of self-worth. Racism, especially when masked behind authority, thrives in silence. Naomi chose to confront it head-on, not with rage, but with calm defiance and truth. Her journey teaches us that knowing your rights, standing firm, and refusing to be defined by prejudice can break even the most oppressive systems. It also shows that change doesn't just happen in courtrooms, it starts in everyday choices, in holding people accountable, and in not backing down when the road gets hard. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of something you faced or opened your eyes to a truth often ignored, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your stories, your voice. This channel isn't just about storytelling, it's about building a community where truth matters.